Hi, friends. I love when a listener takes the time to listen to this podcast and give a review. And today I want to draw attention to Mufasi. I hope I'm saying your name right. Mufasi writes, Tara always offers extremely helpful information to help us grow in every area of the voice. Her podcasts are a must listen for any vocalist or entrepreneur looking to improve their craft. Thank you so much for writing this review, for taking the time. I really appreciate when people do this because it helps me get my podcast out to more people to be helpful to them. So, friends, in today's episode, we focus on how voices are often categorized or labeled. If you have never heard terms used to do this, this episode might just pique your interest. It can be helpful to learn so that you pick the right kinds of songs and keys for your voice. Join me now.
You're listening to the Engaging Voice Podcast with Tara B. Each episode, Tara will bring you insightful instruction on the voice with interviews, technique, and training so you can have a tension-free, healthy, beautiful singing voice that flourishes and lasts a lifetime.
Hey friends, thank you for joining me today for this episode. I want to start by saying that every single one of our voices is truly as unique as fingerprints. No two are exactly alike. And that's why there can even be things like voice activation and other things that are with our voices. But, with the knowledge of that, maybe you wonder well, why are we then trying to classify voices or put them in categories? Isn't that over labeling? Well, there can be different reasons that we do it. And I just want to address some of those today to be helpful, because getting order or classification to voices can help with getting and picking the right music for each person as a soloist, or even choirs as a whole, because sometimes choral directors need to know the types of voices in their choir, so that they know the right range, the feel for that choir. There might be some choirs, I know especially in church choirs, maybe it's just really soprano heavy or really the bottom end heavy, or maybe people can't get super high or they can't get super low, and then you have to pick music that fits that choir. So that's why it's important to know that. I love what Adriana Festeu writes on an online article. It's called Voice Classification System or Art. That was the title of the article. She says this: one of the main reasons for the importance of classification is that regardless of repertoire, singing is ultimately about vocal comfort. And I couldn't agree more. She also goes on to tell about really a big part of voice classifications. It started really coming into being because of the repertoire that was expanding. And especially in the 18th and 19th century, the composers of opera in particular, they were writing music that had higher tessituras, wider ranges, and things which led to really needing singers who could sing consistently some high notes, what we call the tessitura. And also singers, maybe that they couldn't sing as high would be in other parts. They would put them in other parts, but they had to distinguish so that people could actually do these operas and be able to portray and be able to sustain throughout, a 3-hour opera. So here's the deal. Because we're so unique in our vocal apparatuses, it takes more than one kind of category or description to clarify what our voice is like. My guess is that most of you listening today are familiar with these typical groupings in a choir: soprano, alto, tenor, and bass. And soprano, of course, is the women's high voices, alto, the women's low voices, tenor, the men's high voices, and bass, the men's low voices. But that really doesn't give us a whole lot to work with in 4 parts, and we're able to break it down more than that, because that would kind of limit a lot of description. Here's some of the other things that we consider when we're looking and listening to a voice. I already mentioned the word tessitura. That is something that is being able to sing sustainable notes or pitches in a range that's comfy. And it means that you're singing a lot of the same notes. The tessitura is that range where you're on a couple of notes, but depending where they are, we might call it a low tessitura or a medium or a high. For instance, if you are a soprano in a choir, and let's say that a lot of your notes that you're singing are the F, not above middle C, but an octave above that. So like a high F, high G. And you're sitting on those two notes a lot, that would be considered more of a normal range for a tessitura, for a soprano. But it's for an alto, that would actually be considered a really high tessitura. I hope that makes sense. So tessitura is one thing we talk about. The color or timbre of a voice. That is something, if I just said colors in general, and you started thinking about like what comes to your brain when I say yellow or blue or red or pink or purple. You have all kinds of things that pop into your head when I even say those things because those colors mean something to you. You might like some, dislike others, but they have a definite hue or flavor. And so when we think of color in a voice, it's two different, totally different tones. And that could be if you wanted to compare, for instance, in a band or orchestra, like a flute and a trumpet, because both those instruments are higher pitched instruments. But if you think of like what we call the timbre of them, they sound very different from another. And that is how our voices are the same way. There's different sounds and tones. Range would be another thing that we consider with voices, and that would be how high or how low a voice can go. Are they able to sing a 1 octave range, 2 octaves, maybe 3 octaves even? So that would tell you how far apart their voice can go and how many notes, different kinds of notes they can sing, and what's the lowest note they get to and what's the highest note. Another thing is flexibility, and that would be the agility, the quickness of a voice, how fast it can go. Some voices, they can just speedily fly through notes and it's no problem at all. And for other voices, it feels like they're chugging through. The last thing is what we call the weight of the voice, where some people might describe light or heavy voices, smaller, bigger. And that would be like the difference between a clarinet and a French horn. The clarinet has, a sound that you can hear. But if you were talking about a bigger sound or a louder or a fuller sound, you'd probably think French horn. And so of the two. And so it's the same thing with voices. Some voices are just bigger and broader and heavier and fuller sounding, and others just are a little bit more light or lyrical. We'll get into that word later too, but it's the two definite different weights is what we call them. So we were talking about soprano, alto, tenor, bass, which sometimes, if you've been in choir, you know this, it's broken down even further. And I'll come back to the 5 things that I just discussed, like with tessitura. But with soprano, alto, tenor, bass, in choirs, sometimes you'll have pieces of music where it's broken down more. First and second soprano, first and second alto, first and second tenor, first and second bass. But they might call, like the second soprano, they might call it mezzo. In alto, they might call the second alto contralto. In bass, instead of saying first bass, they'll say baritone. So those are also more descriptions. So you've got 8 now that you've broken up the human voice in. But that still those 8 don't define even the color and range and flexibility that we were talking about just a little earlier. And here's the deal. At the end of the 19th century, I told you that things were changing in how the composers were writing. So as everything started expanding of the repertoire, the Germans, they developed a system of organization for the voices. And it's still used today in classical music. It's called the Fach system. No, I did not swear. It is F-A-C-H. And it's the German word which means compartment or box. It subdivides and it clarifies voices just a little bit more. And there's a lot of categories for all of those when we talk about sopranos, altos, tenors, basses. They divide the women, I'll just say, into sopranos, high voice, mezzos, medium voices, contraltos, low voices. And then the men are divided into countertenor, which is the highest male. Then there's tenors, then there's baritones and basses. And the crazy part is, of all of those that I just named, there are even further classifications. I'm just going to tell you these now, but I promise that I will give you a link to a really great article that you can listen to every single type of these voices. And I'll put that in here later. So make sure you watch for the show notes. But starting with sopranos, there are 5 different categories of sopranos: coloratura, soubrette, lyric, spinto, and dramatic. In the mezzos, there's also coloratura, lyric, and dramatic. The contraltos have coloratura, lyric, and dramatic. Then there's the countertenor, that, as I said, the highest of men's voices, which, by the way, it's like the same range as what a mezzo-soprano would be, but it's for men. And there's just one of those. Then in the tenors, they have the lyric, spinto, dramatic, and Helden. In the baritones, there is the lyric, the verdi, and the dramatic. And in the bass, there's what we call bass baritone, buffo, and basso profundo. Now, I am not going to ask you to repeat all of those. It's a lot of classifications. But what I do want to let you know about is just what some of those qualities, those categories are actually describing. And so I'll start with the coloratura because that was mentioned in a couple in the sopranos, mezzos, and contraltos. The coloratura is basically saying that this is a kind of voice that is super agile, very flexible, and has a pretty wide range. The lyric voices, which you'll find in the mezzos, the contraltos, the tenors, and the baritones, and the sopranos. The lyric voices are this lighter voice type. They're not heavy. Remember when I was talking about heavy versus light? They have just this, it's almost like a sweetness in the voice that you would hear. And if you think of, maybe even in a contemporary way, you might think of folk singers, somebody that sings folk songs. Then there is the spinto, which is part of the sopranos and the tenors. And that is like the lyric voices. It is lighter, but the top end of those voices, the top range, it's more hefty for them, those people that are truly spinto. Then there's what we call the dramatic. And these are the big, the rich, the heavy, the loud voices. They're voices that have the ability to carry big sound, beefy, and they have a much easier time even like singing over an orchestra. And if we were talking about more contemporary voices, I don't know if you guys are familiar with these, but think of Steven Tyler from Aerosmith for a male, big, huge voice, or Jennifer Hudson, who's a female singer, and she has just a tremendously big sound. Then we have what's called the Helden, and this is just for tenors. But these are the guys that have the massive ability to sustain and project their sound. And if any of you have ever seen a Wagner opera, these are the kind of voices that sing that. Their pieces of music, their arias, they're always super long and super high, and they have to sustain the power of it throughout most of their arias. So that's a Helden tenor. The baritones have something called verdi, and that's where, as a baritone, not just that they have the range of the baritone, but they can sing the extreme ends of their ranges. It's more of an unusual voice. Same thing with the Helden tenors. And finally, too, this one's quite unusual, but basso profundo, which is in the bass, it is truly the lowest voice that is out there, and there's huge power in this voice. So you can see there's a lot of ways to classify voices. And, I'm not trying to tell this classification to you to put you in a hole or a label so that you can only sing certain things. Because I know sometimes when people feel like they're labeled, they feel trapped somehow. And I will tell you, especially with young singers, you really don't want to label them because you don't know where their voices are going to grow to. But honestly, I'm sharing today because of the possibility of helping you find music, as I mentioned before, as a soloist or a choir director, that's really going to fit you. When we understand our own abilities and limitations, not just our abilities, but the limitations as well, whether in flexibility, range, color, tessitura, or weight, it actually lets us hone in on our super strengths because each one of us have strength in our voices. We can find music then that really fits our voice and lets us shine. And I have tried to do this, especially, I would consider myself at this point a lyric mezzo. I know I'm a mezzo from the range of what I do, but I'm also lyrical in the fact that my voice is definitely lighter. It has more flexibility in it than some voices. And so those are some of my strengths. And so I try to find music and songs that work with that. And, even recently, I will tell you this. Now, this isn't always the easiest thing to do, but there's sometimes songs that we think we can't sing because of, the range it's originally written for or the type of voice. But I'm kind of sneaky with this. I recently decided that since I love the song, O mio babino caro, I wanted to put it in my repertoire. Now, for those of you who are true opera fans, you know that that is a soprano song and it's sung in the key of A flat. But here's the cool part. I can transpose. So I transposed it to the key of F, which as a mezzo fits my voice perfectly. And it still is lyrical enough that it also fits my voice. Now, I would not try to sing something that is Wagner. And I also, if it came to genres that are not classical music, I am not going to try to have something fit my voice that doesn't. And I will tell you this, when I was in my 20s, I was singing in a funk rhythm and blues band. And while stylistically I could sort of pull it off, it did not fit my voice. My voice is, as I said, lyrical. It's not a dramatic voice. It's not a big, heavy voice or a big, exploding, powerful voice. And that genre needs that. And I would feel like I'd be done with the gig and my voice would feel tired or I'd sound kind of hoarse. And I didn't realize that that repertoire was not good for me. And so, even for you, I know not all of you are going to be singing classical music. So when you're exploring the kind of genres that you do, think about genres and songs that might be better for your voice. It might be that jazz suits you. It might be that some folk songs fit you. But you might be the one that also could sing rock, or you might sing, the funk music I was talking about. Or maybe you're more into the classical realm. And there's so many other genres too, but I'm just saying, be the one to explore and figure out, take the time to learn what is your voice part. How would you label yourself with all those different categories of your tessitura, the color, the range, the flexibility, the weight? And then when you figure that out, it's going to help you even know what genres will better suit you. So for those of you who listen today, I have posted on my website, The Engaging Voice, a chart that actually lets you visually see the ranges for certain vocal types. And you can access it there on this week's episode, as well as the article online that talks about where you can listen to every one of the voices that I talked about. Also, some of you may want to have an accountability app because you really want to get into the habit of practicing voice more and more often. So I've made just for you apps and other helps that can help you stay on the bandwagon. I've created a PDF and it's free. It's called Ways to Practice the Voice Consistently. All you have to do is go to the Engaging Voice and you can click on the link there and grab that. This episode and others are available on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Google Play, iHeartRadio, Spotify, and of course on my website, theengagingvoice.com. And guess what? I love this. You can tell Alexa or Siri to play this podcast. I don't have an Alexa myself, but I know it's possible. And Siri, I just tried the other day. For Siri, all you have to do is just say, "Hey Siri, play the Engaging Voice podcast," and she'll do it. The last thing I just want to encourage you to do is to go over and right now and take about a minute or two to rate and review this podcast on Apple Podcasts. You heard at the beginning when I read the review from Mufasi, and I really would love to feature you guys too. So if you would be so kind as to help me out and review this podcast, it will get out to more people, and then I'll mention you on another episode. As always, I appreciate you as a listener.
Thank you for listening to today's episode of The Engaging Voice. Tara is committed to giving you tools each week to keep your voice thriving. Join her next time for another valuable and informative chapter.